Mark's alarm rang at 5:30 a.m., as it had for years. He stretched in bed, feeling the weight of yet another day ahead of him. His job at the tech company, a place he had spent more than a decade of his life, had always seemed like a stepping stone to something greater. But now, at 42, that something greater felt further away than ever. He often wondered how much longer he could keep up the relentless grind without seeing the recognition he longed for. His wife, Emily, was always supportive, but even she had noticed how the job had been draining him, stealing time away from their daughters, Lucy and Grace. In the kitchen, as he prepared his coffee, Mark reflected on his latest project, a complex system upgrade he had been working on for months. It was crucial to the company's future, yet no one seemed to acknowledge his efforts. His boss, Mr. Roberts, barely glanced at him during meetings, only addressing him to point out minor mistakes. The younger employees, eager to impress, often overshadowed him, and the camaraderie he once enjoyed at work had slowly dissipated. It felt like everyone around him was moving forward, while he remained stuck in place, invisible to the people who mattered most. By the time Mark arrived at the office, the day already felt heavy. As he passed through the sleek, glass doors, he saw his colleagues chatting and laughing near the coffee machine. Their lives seemed carefree, their careers on an upward trajectory, while Mark carried the burden of feeling irrelevant. No one acknowledged his presence as he made his way to his cubicle. Sitting down, he opened his laptop, staring at the endless list of tasks in front of him. It was another day of grinding away in the background, unnoticed, just like the day before and the day before that. Despite the constant setbacks, Mark found some solace in his family. Emily would always wait up for him, despite his late hours, with a warm smile and a listening ear. His daughters would rush to hug him when he finally made it home, their laughter briefly washing away the stress of the day. But lately, even those moments of peace felt fleeting. He knew he couldn't keep neglecting them for a job that offered no reward, no appreciation. Yet, what choice did he have? Their future depended on him, and Mark wasn't one to quit. As the clock ticked past 10 a.m., Mark received an email from Mr. Roberts, another meeting, another opportunity for criticism. With a deep sigh, Mark grabbed his notebook and headed to the conference room, already bracing himself for what was coming. Mr. Roberts stood at the head of the conference table, his usual stern expression etched across his face. He was known for his sharp tongue and lack of patience, especially when it came to Mark. As Mark took his seat at the end of the table, he felt the familiar tension building in his chest. Roberts was the kind of boss who thrived on perfection and had little tolerance for those who didn't meet his exacting standards. To him, Mark was a relic of the old guard, competent, but unimpressive, easily ignored. The meeting started, and as expected, Mr. Roberts wasted no time in finding fault. "Mark, these projections are off by 2%, he said, his voice laced with impatience. "Do you have any idea what that kind of error can cost us?" Mark felt the heat rise in his face as the rest of the room turned their attention to him. He wanted to explain that the data had been rushed, that there hadn't been enough time to triple-check every figure. But he knew it wouldn't matter. To Roberts, excuses were a sign of weakness. Mark nodded silently, scribbling down notes as if they would somehow shield him from the embarrassment. This was how every interaction with Roberts went: criticism, condescension, and a dismissive wave of the hand when Mark tried to defend himself. It wasn't the first time he had been publicly scolded, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Yet, each time it happened, Mark felt a little more of his self-worth slip away. Back at his desk, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. His colleagues returned to their own workstations, but he could feel their eyes on him, the unspoken judgments hanging in the air. He had spent years working in this company, pouring countless hours into projects that seemed to go unnoticed. The pressure of constant underappreciation was beginning to take its toll. He glanced at the stack of unfinished reports piling up on his desk, knowing he would be working late into the night once again. He thought of Emily and the girls waiting at home. He could picture them at the dinner table, eating without him, his empty seat a constant reminder of his absence. It wasn't the life he had imagined when he first started this job. Back then, he was full of ambition, convinced that hard work would eventually pay off. But now, it seemed like the harder he worked, the further he fell behind. The promotion he had hoped for was nowhere in sight, and the respect he craved was even more elusive. As the hours dragged on, Mark found himself questioning everything. Was this really worth it? Was sacrificing his time and health for a company that didn't value him the right choice? He tried to shake off the doubts, focusing instead on the spreadsheet in front of him. But the nagging feeling of failure loomed larger with every passing minute. It was during another routine staff meeting a few days later when Mark faced the worst of Mr. Roberts' wrath. The team was reviewing the latest progress on a critical project, one Mark had poured countless hours into. He had stayed late for weeks, missed family dinners, and worked through weekends to ensure everything was in place. But when Roberts started speaking, Mark could tell that nothing he had done would matter. "Well, this is a disaster," Roberts said, tossing the report across the table as if it were garbage. "I don't know how you expect to manage a project of this scale if you can't even handle the basics." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Mark as his boss continued to berate him. "You'll never succeed in this company if you keep making these kinds of mistakes. Frankly, I'm surprised you've lasted this long." Mark could feel his face burning with humiliation, but he kept his eyes on the table, refusing to look up at his colleagues. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Robert's voice cutting through him like a knife. Mark had never felt so small, so powerless. It was as if all the work he had done, all the sacrifices he had made, meant nothing. He had been reduced to nothing more than a failure in the eyes of his boss and his peers. After the meeting, Mark headed to the break room, desperate for a moment to collect himself. As he reached for a cup of coffee, he overheard two of his colleagues laughing softly in the corner. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their conversation quickly caught his attention. "Did you see the way Roberts tore into Mark today?" one of them said, chuckling. "I almost felt bad for the guy, almost." The other laughed in agreement. "He never stands a chance in this place. I mean, you've got to have some backbone if you want to survive here, right?" Mark froze. He had known for a while that his colleagues didn't take him seriously, but hearing it confirmed like this cut deeper than he had expected. He had always tried to be kind, to avoid office politics, and to do his work quietly and effectively. But now it was clear, none of that had earned him any respect. He was seen as weak, disposable. The weight of it all pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. That night, Mark came home later than usual. Emily was sitting on the couch, reading a book, while their daughters were already asleep. As he dropped his bag by the door, Emily looked up and smiled, but she could see the exhaustion and frustration written all over his face. "You're home late again," she said softly, standing up to greet him. "How was your day?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how much to share. He didn't want to burden her with his problems, but he also knew he couldn't keep bottling everything up. "It was rough," he admitted, sinking into the couch beside her. "Roberts really let me have it today. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never good enough." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and comforting. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said. I know how hard you work. You've always been so dedicated, not just to the job, but to us. That's what matters. Your value isn't determined by what Roberts thinks. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind raced with doubts. Was Emily right? Did it matter what Roberts thought of him? His heart told him that his family's love and support were all that should matter, but his mind kept circling back to the shame he had felt in that meeting. How could he continue working in a place where he was so undervalued, so disrespected? He considered quitting. It wasn't the first time the thought had crossed his mind, but now it felt more real, more urgent. Maybe it was time to move on, to find a place where his work was appreciated. But then the practical concerns crept in. How would they manage without his salary? What about the mortgage, the girls' school fees? The weight of responsibility kept him rooted in place, unable to make a decision. The next day, just as Mark was settling into his usual routine, an urgent email flashed across his screen. There was a major issue with the company's flagship project, one that could potentially cost millions if not addressed immediately. The whole office was in a panic, and Mr. Roberts was nowhere to be found. Mark's first instinct was to stay out of it. After all, what difference would it make? But something inside him refused to let the situation spiral out of control. Despite the humiliation he had endured, Mark knew that he had the skills and experience to fix this problem. Without waiting for approval, he dove into the issue, determined to prevent the disaster from unfolding. As the hours passed, Mark worked tirelessly, going over every detail of the project with meticulous care. It was a race against time, and Mark was determined not to let the company fail. He stayed long after everyone else had gone home, fueled by a sense of responsibility and quiet determination. He wasn't doing this for Roberts, or even for the recognition. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. By the time he finally submitted the corrected report, the office was empty, and the sun was beginning to rise. Mark felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, even though he knew no one would thank him for his efforts. As he packed up his things to leave, he glanced around the empty office, realizing that in the end, he had done this for himself, not for the approval of others. The next morning, the office was buzzing with relief. The project had been saved, and the company was safe from what could have been a catastrophic loss. Yet, as expected, no one seemed to know, or care, that it was Mark who had worked through the night to ensure its success. Mr. Roberts arrived late, praised the team for pulling it together, and acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Mark watched from his desk, feeling a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the sting of being overlooked. He knew what he had done, and that was enough for now. Days passed, and while Mark continued to be ignored, he noticed subtle changes in the office atmosphere. Projects were running smoother, deadlines were being met, and clients were happier. Whispers started circulating about how the company had avoided disaster. Some speculated it was the work of a small group of employees, but no one could pinpoint exactly who had fixed the problems. Mark, sitting quietly at his desk, watched from the sidelines. While others speculated and praised themselves, he knew the truth. Yet, for the first time, the need for recognition didn't gnaw at him as it once had. He felt proud of what he had accomplished, not because others were acknowledging it, but because he had proven to himself that he could do it. The sense of inner peace he had discovered during the all-nighter remained, and it started to change his perspective on everything. A week after the project was saved, Mark received an unexpected email. The subject line was simple: meeting request. The sender? The CEO. Confused, Mark clicked on it, reading the brief message asking him to come to the CEO's office that afternoon. His heart raced. What could this be about? Was it about the project? Had they finally discovered who had saved it? As the clock ticked closer to the meeting time, Mark's anxiety grew. He had been with the company for over a decade, but he had never been summoned by the CEO. Part of him was excited at the prospect of finally being recognized, but another part feared he might have made a mistake somewhere. When the time came, Mark nervously made his way to the top floor, wondering what awaited him behind the CEO's door. Mark entered the CEO's office, his palms sweaty as he took a seat across from the stern-faced executive. The CEO wasted no time. "I wanted to thank you, Mark," he said, his voice calm but direct. "I've recently learned that it was you who stayed up all night fixing the critical issues with our project." Mark blinked, unsure how to respond. "I know Roberts didn't give you credit," the CEO continued. "In fact, he took it for himself during the board meeting. But the truth always comes out in the end." Mark sat there, stunned. He hadn't expected this. The CEO smiled slightly, a rare gesture for someone usually so serious. "You've been with us a long time, Mark. It's time you were recognized for your dedication. We're offering you a promotion." As Mark left the CEO's office, promotion in hand, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Relief, pride, and disbelief washed over him. But as he walked back to his desk, he caught sight of Mr. Roberts, sitting in his office, his usual smug expression gone. The news of Mark's promotion had already spread, and Roberts was clearly uncomfortable. He had spent years belittling Mark, never once imagining that the man he looked down on would be the one to save the company's most important project. For the first time, Mark saw something new in Roberts' face: fear. Roberts wasn't used to being overshadowed, especially by someone he had publicly humiliated. Now, with Mark's promotion, it was clear that his position as the company's leader was no longer secure. Mark watched as Roberts avoided his gaze, knowing that the balance of power had shifted. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the promotional offer in his hands. It was everything he had ever wanted: a senior position, better pay, more responsibility. But as the excitement wore off, doubt crept in. Could he handle this new role? Would it mean more late nights, more time away from his family? Emily's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. "Your value isn't determined by what Roberts thinks," she had said. But now, with the promotion on the table, Mark found himself questioning his own worth. Did he deserve this? Was he ready? He knew this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, but something deep inside him hesitated. That evening, Mark sat down with Emily after putting the girls to bed. "They offered me a promotion," he said, handing her the letter from the CEO. Emily's eyes widened as she read the offer. "Mark, this is incredible," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "I knew they'd recognize your hard work eventually." But Mark couldn't share in her excitement. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice heavy with doubt. "It's a lot more responsibility, and I'm worried it'll take even more time away from you and the girls. I don't want to sacrifice our family for this job." Emily placed a hand on his arm, her expression softening. "Mark, you've always put us first. And I believe you can handle this. We'll find a way to make it work." The next day, Mark made his decision. He walked into the CEO's office and accepted the promotion. As he shook the CEO's hand, he felt a mix of pride and determination. He had worked hard for this, and while he still had doubts, he knew that he couldn't let fear hold him back. This was his moment to prove, not just to the company, but to himself, that he was capable. Mark returned to his desk, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like his career was moving forward. But as he glanced at his colleagues, he could sense the tension. Some looked at him with jealousy, others with surprise. They had underestimated him for so long that they couldn't believe he had risen to this level. Mark took a deep breath, knowing that the challenges ahead would be just as tough, but he was ready. With the promotion came new responsibilities, and almost immediately Mark felt the pressure. While he was determined to succeed in his new role, he quickly realized that not everyone was happy with his rise. Mr. Roberts, in particular, was seething. Though he hadn't said anything directly to Mark, it was clear that Roberts was planning something. He couldn't stand the thought of one of his subordinates surpassing him. Mark began noticing small things, important emails going missing, meetings scheduled without his knowledge, and subtle changes in project plans that hadn't been approved. It didn't take long for Mark to realize that Roberts was behind it. He was trying to sabotage Mark's success, hoping to discredit him in front of the CEO and the board. But Mark wasn't the same man he had been just a few months ago. He wasn't going to let Roberts win this time. As the sabotage continued, Mark found himself struggling to keep up with the increasing challenges. It seemed like every time he made progress, something or someone was working against him. But just when things seemed bleak, an unexpected ally emerged. Alice, a longtime employee who had kept her distance from office politics, approached Mark one afternoon. "I've noticed what's been happening," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Roberts has been trying to undermine you, but you don't have to deal with this alone. I can help." Mark was taken aback. He had always seen Alice as neutral, someone who avoided getting involved in the office drama. But now, she was offering him support. With her help, Mark realized he might have a chance to outmaneuver Roberts once and for all. While things at work were heating up, Mark's life at home took a sudden turn when his youngest daughter, Grace, fell seriously ill. The diagnosis wasn't life-threatening, but it required frequent hospital visits and a long recovery process. Mark found himself torn between his new responsibilities at work and the pressing needs of his family. Emily tried to reassure him, but Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was holding everything together at home while he dealt with the chaos at work. Guilt weighed heavily on him. No matter how much success he achieved in his career, nothing mattered more than his family. But how could he be there for them when his job was pulling him in every direction? With Grace's health requiring more of his attention, Mark started making difficult choices. He scaled back his work hours, delegating more responsibilities to his team. For the first time in years, he began prioritizing his family over his job. It wasn't easy. He knew that pulling back at work could affect his chances of long-term success, but he also knew that his family needed him more than ever. Mark spent his evenings at the hospital with Grace, reading her stories and holding her hand as she slept. Emily, always by his side, supported his decision to focus more on their family. "Work will always be there," she said one night as they sat together in the hospital room. "But these moments with our girls? They're what really matter." While Mark was focusing on his family, Alice continued to investigate Robert's attempts to sabotage him. She discovered a series of emails and documents that directly linked Roberts to the missing project files and unauthorized changes. Armed with this evidence, Alice approached Mark, urging him to take it to the CEO. Mark hesitated. He had never been one for office politics, and the thought of going after Roberts felt uncomfortable. But as Alice reminded him, Roberts had been actively trying to destroy his career. "You've worked too hard to let him tear you down," she said. With Alice's support, Mark gathered the evidence and prepared to confront Roberts once and for all. The next day, Mark walked into the CEO's office with Alice by his side. He laid out the evidence, detailing how Roberts had been undermining his work and attempting to sabotage the company's progress. The CEO listened carefully, his expression growing darker with every piece of evidence presented. By the time Mark finished, there was no doubt Roberts had crossed the line. The CEO immediately called Roberts into the office, and within minutes, Roberts was escorted out of the building. His reign of terror was over. As Mark watched him go, he felt a strange sense of closure. The man who had belittled and humiliated him for years was finally gone. The day after Robert's dismissal, Mark was surprised to find a message from him in his inbox. It was brief and to the point, an apology. "I didn't treat you fairly," it read. "You didn't deserve what I did. I'm sorry." Mark stared at the screen for a long time, unsure how to feel. Part of him wanted to be angry, to hold on to the resentment he had carried for so long. But another part of him, the part that had grown stronger over the past months, knew that forgiveness was the only way forward. He replied with a simple, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. With Roberts gone and the weight of his toxic influence lifted, Mark finally felt free. With Roberts out of the picture, Mark found himself stepping into a more prominent leadership role. The CEO entrusted him with overseeing major projects, and for the first time, Mark had the authority to shape the company's direction. He was determined to create a healthier, more positive work environment, one where employees felt valued and supported. Mark began implementing changes that encouraged collaboration and respect. He held regular meetings with his team, not to criticize or belittle, but to listen and offer guidance. Slowly, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. People started working together, rather than competing against each other. And for the first time, Mark felt like he was making a real difference. As Mark settled into his new role, the CEO took notice of his leadership style. One afternoon, the CEO invited Mark for lunch, something that had never happened before. Over sandwiches and coffee, the CEO offered Mark advice on how to navigate the complexities of corporate leadership. "You've got potential, Mark," the CEO said, "but leadership isn't just about getting the job done. It's about inspiring others to believe in themselves and in the work they're doing. You've already started doing that. Now, you just need to keep pushing forward." Mark listened intently, absorbing the wisdom of someone who had spent decades leading a successful company. It was the mentorship he had always needed but never expected to receive. With the CEO's guidance, Mark began to focus not just on his own success, but on lifting others up as well. He started mentoring younger employees, sharing the lessons he had learned through his years of struggle. He encouraged them to believe in themselves, to keep pushing forward even when things seemed impossible. At first, it felt strange. Mark had never seen himself as a mentor. But as he watched his colleagues grow and succeed under his guidance, he realized that this was the most fulfilling part of his new role. The company was no longer just a place of work, it was a place where people could thrive, where they could feel supported and valued. As his professional life flourished, Mark also found a way to bring balance back into his personal life. With Grace recovering and Emily by his side, Mark made a conscious effort to spend more time at home. He no longer worked late into the night or missed family dinners. Instead, he prioritized the moments that mattered most. On weekends, he took the girls to the park, laughing as they played on the swings. He helped Emily with dinner, enjoying the simple pleasures of family life. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he was truly living, not just surviving. The months passed, and Mark's work didn't go unnoticed. At the company's annual meeting, the CEO stood before the entire staff and publicly acknowledged Mark's contributions. "This company wouldn't be where it is today without Mark," the CEO said, gesturing toward him. "His leadership, dedication, and vision have transformed this place." The applause that followed was deafening. Mark, standing in the crowd, felt a wave of emotions. For years, he had craved this kind of recognition, but now, it felt different. It wasn't about the applause or the praise, it was about knowing that he had made a real difference. He had become the person he had always wanted to be. As the applause died down, Mark looked around the room, seeing the faces of his colleagues, old and new. He thought back to where he had started, an overlooked employee, dismissed by his boss, mocked by his peers. But now, he stood as a leader, respected and valued not just for his work, but for the person he had become. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Mark knew there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But now, he faced them with a new sense of confidence, knowing that no matter what came his way, he had the strength and resilience to succeed. With his family by his side and a bright future ahead, Mark was ready for whatever came next.